Godwyn's murder during the Night of the Black Knives is one of the most pivotal events in the Lands Between, not only because it was likely the driving force behind Queen Marika shattering the Elden Ring, but also because it led to the spread of Deathroot and those who live in death. This is because during that fateful night, Ranni performed a ritual. She split the effects of the Rune of Death between her and Godwyn, with the two halves of the curse mark of death being carved into their backs at the same moment. Ranni wanted to kill her own flesh, but didn't want to lose her soul, and so Godwyn was used to this end. The spread of those who live in death is therefore an unforeseen consequence of Ranni's machinations. In this lore video we will be discussing the Prince of Death and the Deathroot. After his murder, the corpse of the fallen demigod was buried in the Deathroot depths, something we can pick up from the Prince of Death pustule. In your first playthrough, most likely the first sight you get of Godwyn is the intro cinematic that shows him being murdered by the Black Knife assassins. Yet despite this gruesome scene, we get the picture of a beautiful godlike figure, a muscular physique, and flowing golden locks. This is also in line with what we see in the story trailer, which again could have been many people's first sight of the Golden Prince. So this later becomes very unsettling when players get their first look at what we learn to be a visage of Godwyn, hidden at the bottom of Stormveil Castle. I genuinely find the look of this face subconsciously disturbing and repulsive. Something deep within me does not like this face. It feels wrong, and when we look at the thematics in a later part of this chapter, you will see this is exactly the intent. It reminds me of an oyster, with its multiple folds of skin, and it is distinctly unnatural and incredibly well done. And indeed the oyster does seem to be spot on, because we will see the full aquatic form of Godwyn later, as well as tying it in with the relevance of water to Godwyn and those who live in death. It is Rogier who later confirms that this haunting face is a relic of the Night of the Black Knives, a visage of Godwyn. Indeed, Rogier warns us away from this face because it does indeed possess the deathblight of Godwyn, the power of the Prince of Death, something Rogier himself has fallen afoul of, an event we can witness through his bloodstain, and now the deathblight writhes through his body. He is saturated by the power of death. When we finally do find Godwyn, the true Godwyn, in the depths of the Lands Between, in the Deathroot depths, it is made all the clearer that the visage we see under Stormveil is a spot-on replica, more or less, of Godwyn's true face. And indeed, this visage is actually just one of many faces of Godwyn. These aren't just relics or bits of skin, these are considered to be true copies of Godwyn's face. For example, the face under Stormveil is actually referred to as a visage of the Prince of Death, something we can see from the Prince of Death's pustule that we pull from this very face. It reads as follows: a fetid pustule taken from facial flesh. It is said that this pustule came from the visage of the Prince of Death, he who used to be called Godwyn. So this is actual facial flesh, it's real, it's a real replica of Godwyn. It initially appears to be a confusing contradiction, given we find the true face later, but Godwyn's appearance is superbly analysed and explained in two videos from Zully the Witch. They are Godwyn Prince of Death and the Terrible Truth About Godwyn videos. I also just want to let you know at this stage that Zully's work will be heavily referenced in this section, as a lot of the details we learn of the Prince of Death's influence and matter comes from the environmental storytelling, and Zully has by far been the most prolific in these subjects in regards to Godwyn. Let us first deal with the replica visage that we had just been discussing. In the video, The Terrible Truth About Godwyn, Zully identifies that Godwyn's image is spreading throughout the Lands Between, as we can see from the deathly pale eye growths in areas where the Deathroot has spread, even spreading as far as Fire Missoula, suggesting this isn't a growth in the normative sense, it is more like a curse, spreading in the Lands Between, but we'll discuss that thematic in a moment. These eyes are clearly reminiscent of the Prince of Death's true eyes, but we can also see these eyes on the growths surrounding him in the Deathroot depths, giving us the true nature of these strange eye growths found spreading with the Deathroot. Zuli therefore suggests that the Godwyn visage in Stormveil could very well be a more advanced type of this growth that has grown from beyond just being eyes, but has become an almost full replica of the Death Prince, and I agree that this is the most satisfying explanation to me, as I had long considered this to be some kind of vestige of the true Godwyn, and given that this is actually made of facial flesh, it seems to be that these eye growths, or the growths spreading throughout the lands between, may well all turn into true copies of the Prince of Death. This does also seem to be backed up by the fact we see his visage duplicated elsewhere. Firstly, in the cysts and pustules, you can see the outlines of Godwyn's face. But of course, there's also the crabs that we find in Altus Plateau and Liurnia, and again you will note that these are all waterlogged areas, and we will deal with that soon. These crabs straight up have the visage, face of Godwyn upon their backs, eyes included, again reinforcing the fact that Godwyn can literally spread his face, his body, far and wide through the Deathroot and through the spreading blight of those who live in death. Does he see through all of these eyes? Does he feel all of these faces? The implications of this are pretty huge, and given enough time, could Godwyn seep through the entire world, turning it into Godwyn? It is definitely suggested that this is the case. It is an unending spread, and the spread of the Deathroot has already transformed patches of the world. Before we go further, we do need to talk about Godwyn's appearance in general, given we are going to be talking about the thematic overlays in the next part of the chapter. In a very surface level analysis, we of course get the immediate allusions to the themes of water, both in the oyster-esque head and the fish-like tail that has replaced his legs. And just as a quick personal note, I absolutely love this design. Godwyn is one of the best designed parts of the entire game. I find it so abhorrent and so shocking compared to his original description in the introduction. It reminds me of the shock I felt when I first faced True King Allant in the original Demon Souls. The cherry on the top, of course, is the blonde hair, still present in this wretched form, a mockery of his original form, and a reminder that this was Godwyn the Golden. Yet there are deeper connections to Godwyn's appearance that we can mine, not just it being an aquatic theme, and again Zuli has delivered on this front in their Godwyn Prince of Death video. In this video, Zuli makes a possible suggestion of Godwyn's appearance being linked to the Japanese myth of the Ningyo, and that it may be seen as a part of a recurring theme in FromSoft games, such as the Divine Dragon, which is referred to as a Ningyo in the game files, and of course Kos from Bloodborne, that share very similar facets to the Ningyo. The Ningyo are essentially mermaids whose flesh, if consumed, confers immortality, but catching one is meant to bring calamity, and this does tie in with the cursed immortality of those who live in death, and so this satisfies me on the aesthetic level. However, there is more thematically, and at this point I'm going to reference another content creator, Acer Aesthetics, and specifically I'm referencing their stellar video on the ideas of pollution and taboo found within Silent Hill, a video called The Horror Lost in Translation, a video that looks at the Eastern cultural influences found in Silent Hill that the Western audience may miss. And in general, Acer's channel is filled with these amazing video essays on some of your favourite games, so please go and check out their channel. The Silent Hill video is extremely useful to me, however, not only because Silent Hill is one of my favourite games of all time, but Acer analyses themes that are also very useful in analysing the themes tied to Godwyn. In this video, Acer uses a certain Japanese term to discuss defilement, pollution and taboos: kegare. Kegare is described by Wikipedia as a state of defilement caused by varying events, including contact with any form of death or corpse. But Acer goes further, describing kegare as the crossing of boundaries, the transitions between life and death for example, and when these boundaries are crossed, you get impurity, you get kegare. In Silent Hill, the boundaries being crossed vary from game to game, but in each game kegare is represented by the horrible nightmares that each protagonist must face. In the first Silent Hill, for example, we witness the horrendous birth of the cult's god. Childbirth is the crossing of a boundary, and thus can fall under kegare. And in Silent Hill 1, Some of the enemies we face are representative of that corruption caused by the Kagari of the birth of a god, such as maggot, grub, and moth enemies. To me, this can be specifically applied to Godwyn's appearance and his corruption throughout the land. To straight up quote Acer when he is talking about a corpse relation to Kagari, he says, and I quote, "Kagari can also mean corruption and defilement. For example, the presence of a corpse corrupts the environment around it, because a corpse is a seedbed for maggots and other impurities, real and spiritual. If you touch it, you will also get Kagari, and you will spread it until you clean yourself." End quote. Does this sound familiar? The presence of a corpse causing corruption that spreads to others, who then spread it further? This is why Godwyn's appearance is so deeply corrupted. He is a living corpse who has been buried, and his corruption has spread. He has crossed the boundaries of natural life. The moment his soul was obliterated, and his corpse was left behind, he became a seedbed for the corruption that pollutes the lands between. Godwyn, through no fault of his own, has crossed these sacred bounds, not only between life and death, but outside the boundaries set by the Golden Order. And he will continue to be a source of impurity, a source of Kagari, until he is destroyed or is brought back within the bounds of what is accepted. And as Zuli points out, there aren't just those who live in death, but there appears to be new life forms that are created by contact with the Death Prince himself, spreading this corruption even further. The examples Zuli gives are of course the basilisks, that have clearly had their eyes modified from prior Souls games to be more in line with Godwyn's eyes in this game. In addition, their connection to Godwyn is made all the clearer by their location in areas connected to death, such as in the Deathroot depths, the realm of the Prince of Death. They wield the Deathblight of the Death Prince, again spreading that corruption, and they also have amphibian features, tying them to the water themes, which we'll look at in the next chapter, and the Piscean features of Godwyn himself. You'll see his arms are very similar to the arms of these basilisks. They of course aren't the only life forms capable of inflicting Deathblight. There are of course the mysterious and confusing worm faces. These are the tree-looking humanoids, with worms burrowed into their faces. The connection to Godwyn is of course clear from their appearance. The maggots or mealworms in their face very heavily connected to death and decay. They also spread the Deathblight. In Zuli's video on them, she interestingly identifies the fact that the file name for these enemies in the game is Déracine, which is a French term referring to the uprooting of trees. Now this does line up nicely with the appearance of worm faces. The worms look like the roots of upturned trees, and I would suggest that their locations are also significant. The two main areas that we find them in are A, affected with Deathblight, and B, have trees. This is the location in Farum Azula and Altus Plateau respectively. So my most likely explanation for their appearance is that they are somehow connected to the areas that are affected with Deathblight that also have trees. Farum Azula does have the infection of Godwyn, so this area we find them in is also afflicted with the Deathblight. Is it possible they are actually trees that have been corrupted? They are very tree and wooden looking. Otherwise, of course, they could have just taken their appearance from their surrounding environments and are pure creatures of corruption. This is of course my speculation on Zuli's video and what we see of the environmental details, but it is one that satisfies my understanding of these beings to a degree. Now, while I'm sympathetic to Godwyn and his plight, this does all paint a terrifying picture about his reach and the transformative, corrupting nature of his power. So with that said, let us look at the spread of his corruption in more detail in the next chapter. The spread of the Deathroot was facilitated by the manner in which his body was handled and buried. We know from the Prince of Death's pustule that he was buried at the roots of the Great Tree, as it reads as follows. It is said that this pustule came from the visage of the Prince of Death, he who used to be called Godwyn. As first of the demigods, it is said he is buried deep under the capital, at the Erd Tree's roots. Indeed, this obviously marries up with what we see in-game, Godwyn's corpse slumped against its very roots in the Deathroot depths. While this may seem like a pretty silly idea in retrospect, it does make sense with the lore of the world, given we know from numerous sources that the Erdtree burial was the idealized form of honouring the dead, where the dead were returned to the roots of the great tree. Yet it was this connection of his body against these roots that facilitated the spread, something that we have confirmed by the description of Deathroot itself, which reads as follows. On the night of the dire plot, the stolen rune of death enabled the first death of a demigod. Later, the rune of death spread across the lands between, through the underground roots of the great tree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. And as expected from FromSoftware's masterful environmental storytelling, this too is reflected by what we see in-game. At Godwyn's throne, we see the Deathblight spreading from his shattered form and infecting the roots of the great tree to spread throughout the world. And of course, it is important to comprehend what this Deathroot really is. The item description says it all. The Deathroot is the fragments of the rune of death that was stolen on that fateful night. These are the fragments of the fragment that was stolen from Malekith, and as such it explains his motivation in working with the hunters to retrieve this Deathroot. He is trying to undo his mistake, to restore the rune of death proper, and thus restore the Golden Order. Geraint actually hungers for the rune of death, for the Deathroot, because he feels the rune of death since it is bound within his own flesh, and we learn from Malekith's Black Blade that it was actually bound within his flesh after the Night of the Black Knives. And as such, he hungers for it to be complete, because it is part of him as well. Tragically, for Malekith, some bells cannot be unrung, and while we return all of the Deathroot, Malekith realises that the affliction of the Wheel of the Centipede has spread too far and has seeped into the very soil of the lands between. The rune of death can no longer be restored.
It is all consumed. Still, I am not sated. Not nearly sated.
So this is where we return to what happened to Godwyn on the Night of the Black Knives. Godwyn only received half of the wound of the centipede, half of the rune of death. This half concerns the death of the soul only, and said Deathroot obviously contains the same half, hence why those afflicted by Deathroot are dead only in soul, but still exist in a corporeal sense. They literally live within death. The reference to this as the mark of the centipede is obviously quite fitting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, this half of the rune does indeed resemble a centipede, but the more relevant connotation, and to why it's probably shaped like a centipede in the first place from a design perspective, is to more do with the ideas of rot and stagnation, a cultural understanding from Japanese Shinto, where flowing water is seen as good, pure, and representative of life, where stagnation is seen as corruption, death, and decay. In short, the idea of purity and the ever-flowing cycle of life in Shinto is commonly represented by flowing water of that flowing circle of life. So conversely, stagnant water is used to represent the perversion or halting of said cycle. Pests and insects thrive in stagnant water, and thus they are often used to depict corruption and rot. And again, this is something prominently seen in the first Silent Hill, in the form of moths, cockroaches, and grubs. Again, as aptly described by Acer, stagnant water is another thematic indicator of Kegare. And to quote Acer directly once more, they say the following: "Flowing water is life, and so it is good. Conversely, still waters are death." Now, in Western culture, we are of course familiar with flies, insects, and maggots being a symbol of death and rot and decay, and indeed this is represented by the flies swarming around Godwyn's decaying corpse. However, it is important to remember that a Japanese team made this, and so it's great to understand the cultural context behind these thematic designs. And so, with the understanding that flies, insects, and other types of pests are representative of Kegare and stagnant waters, we again move to the centipedes. Centipedes fall within this category as a life form that thrives in decay and stagnant waters, and thus, in Japanese culture, centipedes are often used to symbolically represent stagnation or rot or pollution. Of course, the best representation of this is in FromSoftware's media in Sekiro, where the presence of centipede parasites are meant to denote the stagnation and pollution of the divine waters, best illustrated by the monks of Senpo Temple, who are literally overtaken by parasitic centipedes. The association with centipedes is made even more interesting then when we consider the golden centipede, which reads as follows: the golden desiccated remains of a centipede, kept as a fetish by the Golden Order fundamentalists, especially the hunters of those who live in death. As such, they're found near churches or similar. Now, a fetish is usually a talisman or some other object used for spiritual protection, and given it is a golden centipede, the mark of those who live in death, it makes sense that the Golden Order fundamentalists would use this when hunting those who live in death, given it's a golden inversion of their enemy's symbol. This is why the half wound of the centipede is representative of those who live in death, because they are literally stagnant forms of life. They are stuck living in death, stuck at one part of the cycle of life. They are existing outside the boundaries of the established laws. They are an extension of the pollution spilling from Godwyn's corpse. They are Kegari, and so the associated imagery of centipedes and insects make sense. The idea of Kegari and crossing sacred bounds is why so often those who live in death are described to be out with the Golden Order, such as in the description of the holy water pots, which reads as follows: highly effective against those who live in death, even preventing them from rising again. The Golden Order has no mercy for those who trespass beyond life's bounds. It's again the idea of trespassing beyond the boundaries, leading to pollution and stagnation, and the idea of their existence outside the bounds of order leading to a pollution of the order is reflected in the language of the hunters such as D, who states the following:
following only the guidance of the great Elden Ring. Those who live in death fall outside the principles of the Golden Order. Their mere existence sullies the guidance of gold, tainting its truth. And so it is the vermin must be exterminated, down to the very last.
And the ideas of stagnation make sense why the areas we find those who live in death are in stagnant waters. And it also maybe helps explains the aquatic tibia marinas, who seem to be an infection vector for the Deathroot. It is just another thematic manifestation of the themes of stagnation and Kegari. Now, while the half wound of the centipede, being death only in soul, helps explain the undeath of those who live in death, I feel it is only part of the equation when it comes to explaining their existence. As we have just discussed, those who live in death are essentially a glitch in the system, and for this to occur, for a glitch to occur, there has to be a fault in the Golden Order.
You may find this peculiar, but I discovered something in my examination of the Knight of the Black Knives. These souls have committed no offense. They have every right to life, only they happen to touch upon a flaw in the order.
Like Rogier, I actually have a lot of sympathy for those who live in death, and the Dustborn ending was the first one I chose, despite also having Rani's ending ready to go. Rogier correctly states that those who live in death have happened upon a flaw within the Golden Order. It is not perfect, as the fundamentalists would have you believe. And this flaw will be one that those familiar with my channel will of course heard me mention many times, as in my Gold Mask and Marika videos. That flaw being the removal of death and confinement of it. And this is fittingly described by the mending rune of the Death Prince, which reads as follows: formed of the two Halobrand half-wheels combined, it will embed the principle of life within death into order. The Golden Order was created by confining destined death. So the very foundations of the Golden Order are built upon an order absent death, and we see this effect on the denizens of the world, a world where nobody dies. It really is a pitiful state of affairs. Unending life sounds great in theory, but in usual FromSoft fashion, we are quickly disabused of that notion, and when you peel away the surface layer and grandeur of the Golden Order, you can see it is fundamentally broken. For while it is true that those who live in death are stagnant, so are those within the Order. No one ever dies within the Order. How is that any less stagnant than those who live in death? The removal of death and then the murder of Godwyn are the two main events that broke the world, as much as the shattering of the Elden Ring did. And indeed, Rogier seems to agree with that statement, that these were the pivotal events that led to the world becoming crooked.
I once wished to become a scholar, you see. I've spent many an hour scouring the archives for knowledge of that fateful plot. The world has grown crooked, and if you intend to put it to rights, you'd better understand what happened to make it this way.
Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smowtown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.